Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. We're going to talk about a few different topics today. They all kind of center around something, a similar central topic. And before we started recording the episode today, I was looking at an Axios update, and Axios has various problems as a source of political news. But one of the things that's interesting about it is that you can kind of see it um, as a sign of when something has broken through into kind of DC consensus opinion. It's actually quite valuable for that. And there's a new poll out commissioned by The Economist, and the headline that Axios used is that almost half of Americans would describe Trump as racist, cruel, or corrupt, as the sort of when they do like a word cloud. What is it about Trump? And you know those are not positive evaluations, and as we've seen kind of across the polling environment, Trump's public approval continues to go down. I was kind of scanning the different approval averages today, and Nate Silver's, which has tended to be a little higher than others, is, I don't know, like 41% or 40% or something like that. And the one that Elliot Morris does, G. Elliot Morris, is down at like 37% or 38%. So he continues to get less popular. And one of the interesting things about the present moment is that we're very much in full steam ahead mode. There's I mean, Trump is not a course corrector, right? But still, there's his own kinds of course corrections that Trump does, because if Trump is more than an ideologue, he is someone who craves affection and is solicitous of his own power, and public support are key to both of those things. So the things we're going to talk about today, I think, circle around that basic dynamic that Trump is. I'm not sure the bottom is quite falling out in his public support, although it's getting. We're definitely down into term one, first year of term one territory, and seems to be getting worse. But there's no shift. They are continuing full speed ahead with the basic set of policies that have gotten them here to start with. And a little earlier, we saw when the White House had an opportunity to basically say, "You want to extend Obamacare subsidies past the midterms? Like, great, let's do it. Right? That's going to help us. So why not?" But they didn't do that. They really stuck to their guns on that. And I think in general, what we are seeing, like one dimension of what we're seeing, is something that happens to a lot of presidents, but it also happens to a lot of strongmen. That uh, if you only have sycophants and yes men talking to you, you're not going to get information from outside your bubble. And I think we're seeing more and more examples of that. So, Kate, before we get to the first topic we're going to talk about today, is in what you see up on Capitol Hill when you talk to people up there, is is the president's popularity how much is the president's popularity or lack of popularity seeping into the sort of the legislative maneuverings up there, and also the sort of the ever decreasing margin of the Republicans' majority in the House?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it the most with the retirements, right? Which they keep, kind of dropping like flies. People are really headed for the exits. And then I think the other way is in some of these, rules or votes that Johnson has been unable to get through the House. Both of those are kind of the biggest signs um, of Republican defections. And this kind of segues into one of the things we want to talk about today, which is that Tricia McLaughlin is out at DHS. She's the primary spokesperson, but really was more than that. Was one of the main kind of talking heads for the administration. In the political article that like broke her departure, it said that she would often do as many as 5 TV hits a day in addition to podcast appearances. Trump loved her, loves her still. Um, it said in the story, and it's kind of hard to parse what is face saving and what is true. But it says in the story, she was intending to kind of head for the exits in December, ended up staying on longer after the Good and Pretty killings, and is now leaving. And on the one hand, it's kind of a normal tenure for a really high profile flack in a presidential administration. The jobs are so demanding that after a year, a lot of people tend to leave. But it's hard here to kind of untangle that from the unpopularity of ICE, the kind of nose down spiral that the whole immigration project has been in. And, you just kind of couple it together with the other person who's gotten the most, um, or who might be in the most danger from this would be Christy Nome. And after Nome, McLaughlin is kind of the highest profile defender of ICE's policies,
Right,
who made a
right.
name for herself by going out and really combatively saying like, no, these people deserved it and ICE is great, and all that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden, she was considered one of the most effective spokespeople, and now she's leaving. So
Yeah, the one thing, and I don't know if everybody listening knows this, but at least where I saw her most is that she would, we have seen, we obviously know about the Good and Pretty killings, but McLaughlin has been the person that usually within like maybe within an hour of these incidents happening, she would be up on Twitter and probably other social platforms that I don't follow as closely, and saying this terrible Antifa woman, ambushed our ICE officers. They reacted to save their lives and shot her. These totally kind of up is down accounts that are then totally discredited. The same thing that happened with Renee Good, the same thing that happened with Alex Pretty, and for those listeners who don't kind of follow this news as obsessively as we need to, lots of other cases like this. So her brief was basically getting out front with a kind of escape from New York esque account of these different, uh, assaults, shootings, whatever you have, and that was kind of that was her reputation, and so yeah, I don't know. On the one hand, yes, it is a people do tend to cycle out of these positions quickly, because it's high stress, but also because once you've done it for a year, you've sort of built up a brand, and you can go right to a Fox gig, or if you're in a different kind of administration role, you can go right into lobbying, or there's basically, you've gotten your battery charged with a year of high profile service, and you go out and do something else. um it is um it's a little hard for me to figure that this is accidental, that it's not, that it's not part of some, I don't know, repositioning, or just like maybe it's not as fun as it used to be for her. I don't know. Is there any, are we getting any chatter about this, or what this is about, Kate, or kind of, it's just our suppositions?
yeah, just suppositions. And this kind of comes out at the same time that this big Wall Street Journal article comes out about kind of the chaos at DHS under Kristi Noem. And there are all these kind of juicy tidbits in there, like she had to move from one plane to another, left her heated blanket behind, fired the Coast Guard pilot for leaving her blanket behind, had to rehire him when she found out there was nobody else to fly the plane home. Um, little nuggets in there that we've known before, but Corey Lewandowski like avoiding swiping into buildings so he can stay under his uh max days to because he's just like a special employee and you can't serve that many days. Apparently, a whole bunch of people got demoted because they wouldn't give him a law enforcement gun and badge um, within DHS. She Gnome, apparently in this attempt to kind of save face, has become really into FEMA all of a sudden after kind of barking at people to make it smaller and shift the burdens more onto the state. So you have these kind of ridiculous, hastily convened press conferences with like sandbags and hard hats strewn around her as props. It just really clearly showed the two of them are in a PR battle. They know that they're the ones who are kind of taking the flack for everything that happened in Minneapolis, and they're spinning to keep themselves viable. And so it's kind of like whether the McLaughlin departure was kind of planned or not. I do wonder if it'll lessen the pressure on Nome a little bit because, in terms of kind of quote unquote scalps, now you've got, right, Bovino kind of forced into early retirement. Um, Tricia McLaughlin is gone. Homan's kind of taking over, though there is some like kind of interesting interpersonal stuff there as well. Apparently, Noam absolutely hates Homan. So, I guess he's on the rise and her star is a little dimmer at the moment. It's so like, I don't know, the court of a king or something with the courtiers kind of jockeying for better position.
Yeah, let me ask you this. And again, I'm curious just what you see, what you hear in Washington on Capitol Hill. And this is, I don't know if it's right to call it a delicate question. It's a weird topic. I don't know what that makes the question, but it is widely rumored and it has been reported as a consensus understanding that the secretary and Corey Lewandowski are in some kind of relationship of long standing, and that notwithstanding his special advisordom, he is co-running the department. Maybe, you hear in other accounts that he's kind of operationally running it. She's doing the public facing, you know, uh, showing up for photo ops at the concentration camps or, down in El Salvador or stuff like that. Is that it is how much is that part of the discussion kind of off the headlines? Or does it matter? Do people care?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it does because we know that Trump knows about it. Like he brings it up a lot. This is kind of why um, Lewandowski didn't get the chief of staff job to Nome that he initially wanted. Like Trump kind of balked and wanted to keep him, at least nominally at a little
Semi
more
off the
arm's
books?
length.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, we already, we've had I think it was the Daily Mail that published photos of him like toting a duffel bag, to and from her house. That's what kind of precipitated her move on to the Coast Guard base, where the press couldn't get close to them. And, there's been so much reporting that says, yeah, they don't even really try to hide it, within the department, that they're pretty open about it.
Yeah, that's my sense that it's I mean, it's not, generally, usually speaking, you get denials, but as you said, it seems to be totally open. I'm sort of, I mean, at one level, you should have people who are running a cabinet department have some kind of Senate confirmation. I mean, things are so like off the books and rogue under Trump. You kind of say like, is maybe this doesn't count for a lot compared to everything else going on. But on the dysfunction front, what occurs to me is, you said before, and I think this is accurate, that McLaughlin was sort of like this, seemed like, if not the second in command at DHS, like the second most senior person. And that's weird. Like a kind of a White House press secretary is, that's, it's the White House, it's the spokesman for the whole administration. But a spokesperson, I don't know if she was communications director, but basically a flack for a cabinet department. That's not a terribly high ranking thing. It might have some prominence, but no one, so, but that shows you the kind of how these departments are running. now. You have, all of them faced originally the kind of chainsaw hollowing out under Doge, that we know now was fairly indiscriminate, even by the standards of the Trump administration in many ways, cutting things that they've had to hire back and stuff like that. And even though there's been a big bulking up of ICE, they actually did cut a lot of stuff at 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 DHS, and then you have kind of you know the level of dysfunction that is kind of par for the course in any kind of Trump environment. But the big thing, I think, is that Nome, whatever jobs Corey Lewandowski is doing, Nome has been really focused on the public facing, kind of trash talk, defending the various killings, defending the sort of chamber of horrors down in El Salvador where we sent those people from Venezuela. But I have this kind of impression, and I think this impression is right because it's borne out by a lot of reporting, of a department that is significantly hollowed out, and you have it now being run by people who are kind of purely focused on public messaging, you know, trash talk, stuff like that, and the kind of operational stuff, or like what's the, what are we doing, who's running what, that stuff all kind of falls to the wayside, and you get something like this, and that encourages, as you said, the kind of internecine battles between different you know Trump influencers who have jobs at DHS, kind of turf wars, everybody trying to please the president. It all goes together.
And I should have connected this before, but I didn't really until I read the article that no one wants to run in 2028. So all of this is kind of meant to lay the foundation for that, including apparently this like multi-million-dollar ad campaign telling migrants to go home that like had her face all over it. And apparently the White House was really unhappy about it because it was just like so transparently, a presidential ad bid,
Right,
basically.
right. It's hard. I mean, no one. Well, let's put it this way. They're looking for immigrants to self-deport. No would-be presidential candidates self-deport. Right? You can't expect the candidate to know that it's hopeless. But I will say that, like, even before she took the DHS job, I don't think she's. I don't think she's presidential material. I also don't think she's electoral material. I don't think she's not a strong candidate. But there's like th- there's basically no way, even if you imagine like a JD Vance candidacy and a JD Vance candidacy winning, I don't think they're going to be leaning into like the Alex Pretty killing and the Renee Good and stuff like this. This is unquestionably, I mean, no one disputes that ICE now, even if it is the whole mass deportation campaign, that ICE and Customs and Border Protection and mass deportation are not really unpopular. People are really bummed out about it, and she's the spokesperson for that. She's the poster girl for that. So the idea that she's like a viable president, like, great, more. I'd love to see it.
I've been thinking about this a lot with, Vance as the presumptive nominee, that if, I mean, obviously we're still many years away, but if the administration ends, around the levels of unpopularity that he has so far performed at, it's, I mean, Vance is going to have the Kamala Harris problem, right? Like he's going to have to find a way to distance himself from Trump, um, without the silliness of, you were the vice president, why didn't you XYZ? And then layered on top of that is fealty to Trump is the whole game. So, look how difficult Harris found it to separate herself from Biden, who, Democrats do not at all have the same level of fondness for that Republicans do for Trump. And, I just think it's going to be incredibly difficult. I mean, it's going to be a really hard um, little line to walk. And as you say, like Gnome, if anything, would have to do that same work, but from a more difficult position. that she has ownership of, what is at least right now the least popular part of the agenda. And kind of going into it, it made sense, right? Like if you're really ambitious, you probably wanted to have your fingers in the immigration stuff because that's like the guiding light of the whole administration, right?
Hmm.
I mean,
Hmm.
that's what he ran on. Arguably, you could say like that was the biggest policy plank. But when that's her whole portfolio, I mean, again, she's like trying to make FEMA a thing right now. It's not going to work. So if that's her whole portfolio, kind of hard to run from. Whereas you can see Vance, it would be tactical for him to at some point kind of start talking more about the less hot button stuff that he's in charge of, right? And so that at a certain point when the ice killing stuff comes up, he's like, "Hey, I was doing X, Y, and Z. That was Christy Noem's racket. I did my best to kind of advise from the outside, but that was not my remit."
Yeah, I think that if it were not for the Trump loyalism issue of Trump of you can't criticize Trump or he will destroy you, that if it weren't for that, Vance's ability to create distance from Trump would be, I think it would be not convincing to most sane people, but there's a pretty clean and logical as far as it goes way to do that, and that you can in a gentle but clear way say Trump's weird and he's kind of crazy and he's all over the place. I'm not like that. I'm normal, but I'll keep doing the same stuff, but I'm normal. I don't do weird tweets and stuff like that. And for a lot of people, what the problem with Trump is just his not so much or not simply the cruelty of his policies, but the intemperateness, the classlessness of him, the again, not just the cruelty of his policies, but you see him talking and he embodies it, that kind of stuff. And Vance isn't that guy, but as you say, he can't. That card is not available. I mean, as long as Trump is alive, that card is just not available to him to play. So yeah, it's a hard job for him to do, and at least for the moment, as you say, it's a tough record, not a popular one.
So, we've done some beating up on Republicans. Now we have to beat up on Democrats a little bit.
All right, let's do it.
So there is this weird drama coinciding with the beginning of early voting for the Texas Senate primaries. And what happens is basically Stephen Colbert, uses his intro in his show to say that he intended to air an interview with James Talrico, one of the candidates, and that CBS told him under no uncertain terms that he was not allowed to do that. Um, and so basically, he released the interview on YouTube instead, kind of cloaking it in this whole like, this is the interview they didn't want you to see. It has reaped dividends, like a bajillion views. Talrico said that he raised like $2.5 million in the 24 hours after this all happened. Um, and so Crockett is mad, right? Because this is like perfectly timed for Talrico, right? And she basically gave a little press conference where she said they're lying, that what CBS said was not you can't air the interview, but that you're perhaps running afoul of the fairness rules where you have to offer an interview to Talrico's competitors as well. And this seems to be right because what Brendan Carr has basically done at the FCC is tighten up the equal time rules, whereas there used to be exceptions for things like Colbert Show and like The View and these kind of less straight newsy shows, but that would occasionally have interviews with politicians. That more kind of entertainment branded stuff would get more of an exception where they wouldn't
Hmm.
have to conduct all these interviews because
Hmm.
it's not really their bread and butter. Like The View is not going to interview all 8 people running for Senate in Texas or whatever.
Right,
He
right, right.
tightened that up. He said, we're going to hold you more under the standards of kind of a standard news show. Um, so I think she's right. Like, I suspect that they didn't just say, "You can't air the interview," that they said, you know, you'll probably have to offer this time slot to other people as well. And so he opted to not air the interview on TV to have to kind of fulfill those
Right.
requirements.
Right.
But it's kind of brilliant for Talarico. I mean, Colbert with the huge assist here, but for
Right.
Talarico to brand it as Trump wants to silence me. I'm such a threat to them that they don't want me on TV. And it's
Yeah.
also created this kind of hilarious knock on thing where, you know, conventional wisdom here is that Republicans want Crockett to win. They think she will be easier to beat. And so you have like Eric Erickson's and stuff being like, wow, like silencing a black woman. They don't want to give her shot on TV. And it's like, yeah, I bet you're really torn up about it, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I saw, I didn't know she had spoken about it yet, but I saw that as the kind of nominal rationale. And it's sort of an example of Carr and company have rightly have so little credibility that, like, what they say is, you would assume, you need to assume the opposite of what they say. But if you, I mean, I'm not sure I have too much of a dog in this fight, in that primary, but the primary is coming up. And if you were a Crockett supporter, you would kind of say, wait a second, okay, that's even if this hadn't happened, if he gets to do a Colbert interview, like, that's a big, that's a big boost. Shouldn't she get a shot? That's not crazy. That's not crazy. And it's possible. I mean, again, it's one of these things where CBS at this point, since it's owned by Paramount, Skydance, whatever, Ellison Inc. They are, it's Cars, FCC, and them. So they're both Trump toady liars. So not a lot of credibility, but kind of, it might kind of be that here, but certainly for Tallarico, like, who cares? Right. It's no one. Like, you have to be pretty deep into this to say, well, maybe there's this, equal, kind of, it's not the fairness doctrine, but this thing where you have to let candidates on at the same time. And I don't think it would. I don't know, but, like, it would certainly seem logical to me that you don't have to put on the Republicans. That's for the general election, and that's a separate race. You just, put on Crockett. You don't have to put on, like, whoever's, like, running at 1% or something like that. So it's not a bad point. But also, as I think we were talking about this just last week. Maybe it was the week before, when there was this influencer allegedly saying, I can't remember what he said, but it was one of these things where it wasn't clear if he had said something that
He's
was
he allegedly said that Colin Allred is a mediocre black man.
right, as opposed to maybe a mediocre candidate. In any case, that had broken his stride. So it's, for Tallarico, this is a good, you know, he needed a boost, and this seems to have gotten him one.
And this by him, I think, has been savvy in a way that I think he has not been up until this point, which, this redounds to my biggest kind of point about who's better to win Texas. I always come back to this thing that the Democrat of the caliber who's going to win Texas statewide is, you don't have to worry about electability because they're going to be electable. They're going to win the primary because they're really exceptionally talented. That's what it's going to take. And with the all red stuff at the time, we were talking, we already discussed this in the podcast, but it was this like kind of racial justice symposium thing of it just kind of eye rolling. And then there was another little flare up recently where Crockett says that Tallarico's super PAC, or a super PAC aligned with him, was putting out racist ads. And he, when asked about this, was like, just do reporting on, like, yelled at the reporters, was like, you should be doing reporting on this. Like, you see the ads, like, why are you asking me something? Which I also was like, nah, yelling at reporters is not usually the sign of like a super skilled candidate. But the handling of this has been smart. Um, and I think it's, whether or not they're right, it is pretty indisputable at this point that, like, the right wants it to be Crockett, right? And it's funny to imagine, like, Brendan Carr boosting the candidate that, again, rightly or wrongly, they're more threatened by, on the first day of like early voting in Texas, kind of an in-kind contribution on that one.
Yeah, I don't. It's funny. I thought, as you said, I mean, he may have stumbled recently, but I thought, in when he first came onto my radar in, in the middle of 2025 or something like that, he seemed pretty. He seemed like, he seemed pretty good. He seemed like he had he had a campaign message that I think is arguably a good one for a Democrat, in Texas. We've tried, Democrats have tried some other angles; those haven't worked. You try something new, but we agree that, there's always a fallacy in the idea that you need to, protect your favored general election candidate in like bubble wrap. There can be, that may have some place, but if they have what it takes, they need to, at some level, they need to demonstrate it. And demonstrate it in a primary, even though obviously primary is different electorate and all that kind of stuff. A good argument for electability is usually pretty persuasive in Democratic primaries, um, as long as it is not a kind of clumsy one that is basically being the most anodyne
Mhm.
candidate. So
Yeah, I mean, and I wanna make clear, like, I absolutely think that Crockett being a Black woman hurts her, and maybe no Black woman could win statewide in Texas, like, I could totally buy that, but then, you know, everyone thought we could never have a Black president, right? And he was so talented that he was able to, like, overcome that totally unfair electability bias, And so I think, as much as that sucks, like, that's at play here as well. And one thing I've been thinking about, now that we're kind of getting into the midterms, I mean, it's kind of shocking that they're upon us like this, is the Senate races are going to be so interesting for the obvious reasons. And then also just because you've got to think if there's any risk to Schumer, it evaporates if Democrats win the Senate, right? Like, he's totally secure. Like, he's not going anywhere. He'll be kind of like the king if he manages to win the Senate in conditions like this. And I've been wondering about, everyone expects Democrats not to win the Senate, right? So, like, what are the conditions under which they lose in a way that still kind of shores up Schumer's footing versus losing badly enough that it might maybe possibly, kind of prompt someone inside the caucus to get serious about going for his job, trying to dislodge him in a more real way than the plan seems to be right now, which is just kind of everyone assuming he's not going to run again in 28.
yeah, it's like paradox. I mean, I think you're right, and I don't think what I'm about to describe will happen, but you can sort of, possibly imagine a scenario where, Democrats do really well, and let's say they wildly overperform what anybody thinks is possible, and now they have like a 52 seat majority, like a real wave election. Um, those could be, you could have a number of new senators who had either run on that Schumer should no longer be the, majority leader, or party leader in the Senate, or, something more generic, but coming in kind of wanting a new, a new regime, as it were. I think that, the issue. I mean, there are a lot of issues with Chuck Schumer. In some ways, maybe the biggest one is just generational, as opposed to, you know uh, where he is ideologically, where he is in the caucus, stuff like that. Because what always makes um, a legislative, you know a campaign for leadership in a legislature different from real election is that, okay, who? Yeah, you don't like Schumer, but who is the other person you are for? Now, I think, in some ways, I don't know. Brian Schatz is the one who's kind of in the trajectory to be. I mean, I think it's widely assumed he'll be the number two leader if Schumer remains leader. He would be sort of the logical one to go next. But and I like Brian Schatz, but is he going to be that much different from Chuck Schumer? Because he answers to the same caucus, right? And this is what I think from the outside is just not always clear about parliamentary political leaders. Is that you really are like I don't know, you're like the lobbyist for a trade association, or it's a heavily consensus thing. The member, you need to get all the members on board with something, and really kind of all of them on board, especially if you're in these tight seat margins. And when you need to do that, that makes it hard to do what people on Blue Sky want you to do. And when I say people on Blue Sky, I'm not being denigrating. I'm including people like myself, right? It's you're responding to the same caucus, and so in some ways, you really need you need new senators, and you're starting to get that to some extent. I know people talk about Murphy from Connecticut as like he's sort of someone like, okay, you have a leader like that, but again, you can have whatever leader you want, but they're still responding to the same caucus. And that is really that's what makes it different from being like a president or something like that, when you're sort of notionally answering to a constituency at election time or something like that. This is different. You need to have you need all those people lined up for every vote. And so the question really is who else if it's not Schumer, and that then I think it gets a lot harder.
And the fundamental problem is that, Schumer and Jeffries are so, by the nature of the job, overwhelmingly concerned with protecting their most vulnerable members, right? Because those are the hardest to win seats and they want to make things the easiest as possible for them. And that leads us into this kind of snake eating its tail loop of a lot of frontline members are all getting these same kind of consultancy talking points, advice. This is where we get the you can't talk about Epstein, you have to talk about kitchen table issues stuff, and like the fear of fighting and the huge interest in seeming bipartisan and amicable to Republicans, and a lot of these dynamics that kind of feel from a bygone era of American politics. And I think whether or not Jeffries and Schumer should kind of more onus should be put on them to like question these kind of hackneyed old pieces of advice. Like that's where I think a lot of the propulsion is coming from, because they are just simply more kind of intertwined with the fates of those members than they are the progressives from the safe blue seats.
Yeah, it's always the dynamic, and yeah, that's just how it is. And again, I think this is also a moment where it's important to remember that the Democratic Party is not structured like the Republican Party, in the sense that the Republic, for all people talk about, oh, the different factions and the different factions in MAGA and all these kind of different things. A lot of that is, I'm not sure it's not true, but it's at least not remotely true in the way it is for the Democratic Party. In among Republicans, you often have these kind of different ideological impulses, people who kind of believe similar things, but one group believes it to 5, the other group believes it to 11. That fundamentally, and this is something that I think is just so important to always come back to for understanding American politics, that the Republican Party is a party of white conservative Christians, and increasingly white conservative Christian men. Now, there are non-whites, there are non-Christians, there are women, there are no non-conservatives. But if you are a black Republican, if you are a Jewish Republican, you may be totally for the Republican Party, but you live in the white conservative Christian house, and you need to be okay with that, right? It is dominated by that demographic group in the United States, and that always makes it pretty elementary. Whose plan are we going to go with? Well, we're going to go with the white conservative Christians' plan. Whereas for Democrats, you have uh, union members, um, affluent liberals, affluent urban city liberals, African Americans, um, people who are on various kinds of public assistance, Hispanics, Asian Americans. Those are those groups often have very little to do with each other, right? They really come from different worlds, and they align to a great extent on a common set of policies. But what do Hispanic voters and African American voters? How much do they kind of live in the same world as affluent white liberals? Pretty different worlds, right? The LGBT community, all these different, it is a it is a coalition party. That makes it harder to have defiant, clear messages. Which is not to say that we shouldn't constantly be yelling at them to do better at it, because they need to do better at it. But there are reasons why it's challenging.
Also, the Republicans in Congress have physically structured their conference to enable their farther right wing, right? Like that comes in the discharge petition stuff with the speaker, or having these like limits on chairmanships, and it makes them less beholden to seniority, and
Hmm.
it's a lot easier for their kind of hard right flank to hold the party in its thrall. And I think, for better or worse, right? Clearly that doesn't always work. Clearly that sometimes leads to disasters. The million round votes for McCarthy. They've had a ton of turnover at the top. It creates a system where it's really hard for their leadership to kind of keep their jobs and keep approval. But the bright side of that is that their kind of frontline leadership is much younger, and it's much easier to kind of trade out the dinosaurs for
Hmm.
uh, fresher blood and fresher ideas. And so even just like the very kind of logistical structure of the two congressional entities are different.
Right.
And that also kind of redounds to the Democrats being in the vice-like grip of like 80-year-olds, because it's just so set in stone, the kind of seniority system. You work your way up, you pay your dues, right? Like Jeffries was supposed to be kind of the big, we're letting go of this, right? We're like finally letting someone who's not geriatric be in charge of anything. But still, it's like he came up the Pelosi pipeline, right? Like she knighted him. Like
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
has the stamp of approval because he proved himself kind of willing to behave the way that Democratic congressional leader has more or
Yeah.
less always behaved.
Yeah.
And I think,
Absolutely.
the times where we've seen that be a little different is really based on the kind of strength of personality of the people who happen to get in that role. Thinking of like Harry Reid, really the last time Democrats just had a bare knuckle brawler in leadership.
Pelosi to some extent.
Yeah,
She's different, a different,
legislatively for sure, for
yeah,
sure.
a different kind of player. But I have long thought that Nancy Pelosi is like one of the greatest legislative leaders of the last, certainly in like basically in anybody's current political lifetime.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is important to understand how much those leadership elections are kind of like club elections, although it is equally the case that voters and Democratic activists need to, and the great overlap between those two buckets, need to make clear that we actually sent you there. Here's what we want, and if you want to get elected again, I mean, because we see this especially in the Senate, the sort of Senate brain, this idea like, oh, we're senators up here, and this is appreciate the vote, but like, once you get here, you kind of, you get a broader perspective, and there's things you understand that voters don't. Well, either the senators need to explain really clearly in words we can understand the mysteries they have been enrolled into, or they should listen to what voters say. So there's definitely things that um, voters can make their will known, make their opinions known, and they should.
So the last thing we wanted to briefly just kind of preview, because our pod will come out after this next week, is that on Tuesday is the State of the Union. We have a team here who will be live blogging it, so you can come and follow along. And it's just kind of an interesting exercise at this point because we've been through so many years of this back and forth about how do you cover Trump when he speaks, right? And we've gotten through these very distinctive phases. Like early on, it was this huge emphasis on fact checking, right? And that the only way to kind of responsibly transcribe his speeches is to have, a yellow highlighter every other line that's like, this isn't true, this isn't true, here's why that's not true. And that ran into, I think, the pretty like predictable roadblocks, even though it's quite well intentioned, of it takes a while, it's so much faster to lie than it is to correct the lie.
Hmm. Hmm.
And a lot of times such resource heavy reporting, I mean, you can't do it every time he opens his mouth, right? It's just too much work. Um, so that kind of faded. We got into the deplatforming Trump phase, which is you just shouldn't air his remarks at all. And that's a way to kind of like save yourself some time on the fact checking end. And that ran into, well, then people forget how crazy he is when they're not seeing him talk. And you're left with these kind of whitewashed headlines of like, Trump discusses the economy in Pennsylvania, and the content of the speech is like he's going off about like water pressure and, birds running into whatever. Um, and now I don't know. I guess we've kind of landed in an in between place where like people are more willing to let his clips kind of stand for themselves. There seems to be maybe more of a shift into like, it doesn't really help him when he speaks a lot of the time. So just kind of, give it to the people and let them make up their own minds. But it's just kind of funny because going into a State of the Union under any other president, we would have probably like things we're looking for or, indicators. And if Trump was a normal president, I think you'd be going into it trying to assess how much the administration feels its own crumbling popularity by, is the speech going to be completely about like economics and affordability stuff? Um, how much is there going to be immigration stuff in there? How much are they shying away from Minneapolis? Does he talk about the killings? These are the kind of normal questions to ask. But with Trump, you're just like, his speeches are just so often not that closely fettered to strategy. And to the extent that they are, he will read off the teleprompters in this kind of languid, bored voice and then take a tangent into something that he thinks is more interesting, like, water pressure. Um, and then he kind of seems to consider it a success if it was really long, right? So he can kind of say, I'm energetic and virile in a way that Biden was, and I just got up here and spoke for 3 hours. So there, everything's laid to rest. I'm in charge. I'm powerful. You all love me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, yeah, we are all. It's Donald Trump's world, and we are living in it. I did always think that the deplatforming or don't amplify that doesn't. There may be a logic to that with certain things on the margins of the political spectrum that should be on the margins of the political spectrum. Obviously, some people would question whether that should is ever a thing, but the president of the United States, the one who holds all the executive power, is not marginal. So I have always been a big supporter of the idea that there is a very big place and a very legitimate place for engaged news reportage. You shouldn't be neutral. You don't have to be neutral. The idea that you're going to that you're going to shield people from it, or it's beneath you as a news person, um, I just that doesn't make sense to me. And the only upshot of that is basically providing a sanitized version of Trump to the middle of the electorate, right? Making him seem more normal, basically. And because you're not stopping the Trump people from seeing him. They're gonna they get a direct line. That may have been possible in a period when there was much more centralization of control of the news. When we had three before we even had four TV networks, before the cable networks, before the influencers, blah 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 blah. I never thought that made sense. I agree with you though. It does continue to make it hard to know how, as a journalist, like, what do you do? I mean, I think at this point you kind of say, like, we're just gonna, like, um you know put on the garbage bags with the armholes in them, right? When you go into a mess, and we're gonna see what happens, and we're gonna point out what is false, and kind of do the best we can. I do think we're again at a point where people are seeing that, or the elites who at least have a pretension to have some control over the news economy, see that people don't people see Trump a lot, and they're not crazy about what they are seeing. I mentioned those keywords from a poll, that new poll. Racist, cruel, corrupt. Because funny, like, cruel is a funny word, because that's not a word you hear in, like, in normally in those kind of political thought bubbles. You'll say liberal, conservative, too conservative, uh, doesn't care about people like me. These things that are kind of personal, intuitive slash policy things. But you have words like cruel, awful, hurting people in their dying moment. Just like, you're like, wow, these are pretty intense words you're coming up with. So yeah, it is a challenge, but definitely check us out for our live blog for the State of the Union. I think we do it kind of unlike anybody else, and it's you're getting sort of informed responses and commentary on real time. Which, even though I know a lot of us watch these things on Twitter or Blue Sky, and that definitely serves a purpose. But you don't know quite, often you don't know quite who you're listening to. So that's Tuesday, right? Okay, the
Yep.
State of the Union. Got it. Okay, I think that is it for this episode. Anything else we need to discuss?
Nope. See you next week.
All right, see you next week.